Welcome to the Pod-Key summary of Australian Army during World War II. Today's story is really about how Australia's army was forced to grow up fast in the Second World War. It starts with a defense plan built around Singapore and Britain, then runs straight into the shock of 1942, when that whole assumption collapsed, and Australia had to rethink everything from strategy to training to equipment. Along the way, you get a huge citizen army, brutal campaigns from Tobruk to New Guinea, bitter arguments over late war operations, and a human cost that went far beyond the battlefield. Before the war, Australia put a lot of faith in the so-called Singapore strategy. The idea was that defense spending should lean heavily toward the Navy, and that if things went badly in Asia, Britain would send a fleet to reinforce Singapore. Some people warned this was shaky from the start. Critics like Henry Winter argued that if Britain was tied up in a European crisis, it might not be able to help at all, and Singapore itself was exposed to attack from the land and the air. That warning turned out to be painfully accurate when Singapore fell in February 1942, and fell fast. At that point, Australia had a big force at home, but it was still inexperienced, and too many troops were committed in Malaya. The shock of Singapore pushed the government to pull formations back from the Middle East and seek direct American support. That was the decisive turn away from imperial defense and toward regional self-reliance. The army expanded at remarkable speed. It went from about 80,000 personnel in September 1939 to 476,000 at its peak in August 1942, with 11 infantry divisions and 3 armored divisions. For a country of 7 million people, that was enormous. Around 730,000 Australians enlisted during the war, roughly 10% of the population, and nearly 400,000 served overseas. But scale was one thing, balance was another. In 1942, the Army had 137,236 men in combat arms and only 29,079 in ordnance, which tells you the force had a lot of fighters and not nearly enough of the people needed to equip, maintain, and sustain them. That mismatch put pressure on logistics and on the wider economy, and by late 1943, the government was already cutting back. 100,000 soldiers were removed from the army to release workers for industry, and the planned force was reduced to 6 infantry divisions and 2 armored brigades. So even in wartime, there was a constant tug-of-war between military ambition and what the country could realistically support. The army that entered the war was trained for a pretty conventional European model of fighting. It did not have a settled doctrine for jungle warfare, which became a very serious problem once Japan entered the war, and militia units were sent into New Guinea. Those units often faced the enemy with inadequate preparation, shortages of equipment, and very limited experience. The early fighting on the Kokoda track and at Buna made that brutally clear. In 1943, the Army tried to redesign itself for jungle conditions by cutting back heavy weapons, vehicles, and overall divisional size. An infantry division lost about 4,000 authorized positions under this jungle organization. That helped, but only to a point. And it turned out some firepower still mattered very much. So artillery and anti-tank units were restored for the campaigns of 1944 and 1945. What really changed things was turning adaptation into a system. Training centers like Canungra and the staging area on the Atherton tableland created a pipeline for jungle preparation. And by 1945, Canungra was producing about 4,000 reinforcements a month. This was part of a broader shift too. The Army was moving away from British templates and building structures that actually matched Australian terrain, disease environments, and operational reality. Australian soldiers fought early in North Africa, Greece, Crete, Syria, and Lebanon, and then became the principal Allied land force in many operations in the Southwest Pacific. In North Africa, they helped capture Bardia and Tobruk, taking about 40,000 and 25,000 Italian prisoners respectively, which is a very large result by any standard. The defense of Tobruk became one of the iconic episodes of the war. It lasted far longer than the original 2-month expectation, and Australian units there suffered 3,009 casualties, including 832 killed and 941 captured. At El Alamein, the 9th Division's fighting on the coast drew German forces away from the main breakthrough sector. A reminder that a formation can have strategic weight well beyond its raw numbers. In the Pacific, the Army was central at Milne Bay, where Australian troops helped inflict Japan's first notable land defeat, and later in the fighting that drove Japanese forces back across New Guinea. What's striking is how much the Army improved. After those painful early failures, Australian troops increasingly developed a real tactical edge in jungle fighting. By 1944, American forces had taken the main offensive role in the Southwest Pacific, and Australian units were more often assigned to garrison work and what was often called mopping up. Even so, the government committed them to operations on Bougainville, New Britain, Etap-Uwak, and later Borneo. Part of the logic was practical. These operations freed American divisions for the Philippines. Part of it was political too. Australia wanted to preserve influence and avoid being sidelined in a war happening in its own region. These campaigns have stayed controversial because many Japanese forces were already isolated and strategically weakened. Critics, including Peter Charlton, argued the operations were politically motivated and wasteful. Supporters pointed to the destruction of remaining Japanese forces, the protection of Allied bases, and the liberation of occupied territory. Borneo captures the whole argument in one case. Tarakan took longer than expected, and its airfield was not reopened until after much of its intended usefulness had passed. But the campaign also secured oil fields, isolated Japanese forces, and freed prisoners of war. Inside the Army, there was a long-running rivalry between the all-volunteer 2nd AIF and the militia, whose members were partly conscripted and at first could only serve in Australian territory. That legal barrier was lifted in January 1943, although in the end, only the militia's 11th Brigade actually served outside Australia. The war also shook up old assumptions about who was fit to command. Prime Minister Menzies made a point of giving many senior 6th Division commands to reservists, and officers like Leslie Morshead, Stanley Savage, and Edmund Herring built impressive combat records. By 1945, regular officers held half of senior appointments, but they were still underrepresented at battalion level. So the war changed not only the Army's size and doctrine, but its internal pecking order between professionals and citizen soldiers. At the start, the Army was badly short of modern equipment and heavily dependent on outdated, mostly British-designed gear. Australia even sent reserve rifles to Britain after Dunkirk, which was generous, but also not ideal when you are short yourself. Over time, local industry adapted and produced some genuinely Australian answers, including the Owen submachine gun, the short 25-pounder for jungle fighting, Australian-made Bofors guns, and the Sentinel tank. The Sentinel never saw combat, while the Matilda Tucken turned out to be much more useful in jungle operations than big armored formations had been expected to be. By 1945, the shortages had flipped into surpluses. The Army held 1,516 25-pounders when it needed only 406 for combat and training, and 1,941 anti-tank guns against a requirement of 530. That is one of those very wartime outcomes where the problem eventually becomes having too much of what you once could not get enough of. The human cost of the war was severe, and it was not limited to men killed in battle. Nearly 29,000 Australian Army personnel became prisoners. More than 21,000 were captured by Japan, and only about 14,000 survived that captivity. The difference between captors was stark. Prisoners held by Japan faced malnutrition, disease, forced labor, and routine brutality. Nearly 2,650 Australians died on the Burma-Thailand Railway. 77% of those held at Ambon died, and thousands more were lost in the Borneo death marches and the sinking of the Montevideo Maru. Overall Army losses included 11,323 killed in action, 11794 who died of wounds, and 21,853 wounded, but there were also 121,800 wounded or injured in non-operational areas. Disease, accidents, and captivity were central parts of the war's toll. Women's service mattered here too. Army nurses served in every major theater, and 71 were killed on active service, including 41 during the fighting in Malaya and Singapore in early 1942. The Australian Women's Army Service recruited about 24,000 members for clerical, driving, signaling, radar, searchlight, and anti-aircraft work. About 35,000 women served in the Army overall, around 5% of the force. The government kept most of them from overseas service until 1945, so only about 400 AWAS personnel served abroad, but their work still freed male personnel for combat roles and became a vital part of wartime mobilization. What comes through in all of this is an army and a country, improvising under pressure, making mistakes, adapting quickly, and carrying a very heavy load. It is a story about battles, absolutely, but also about logistics, politics, training, industry, and the limits of national capacity, which is usually where history gets very real very fast. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.